Welcome to the second colloquium in our series of Unpacking Poverty and its Impact on Student Success. The idea of this series is to give us a deeper understanding of how poverty impacts student success and what we can do about it. And our thesis is that by unpacking poverty and looking at its components, not as a general whole, we can have a deeper understanding of how poverty impacts students, how those impacts vary by time and place, and what we can do about them. Today's topic is concentrated neighborhood poverty, and it's brought to you by the members of the Pathway from Poverty Consortium. I'm Dr. Robert Balfance, and I will be talking through the first section. You'll also hear from Maxine Wood, you'll hear from Richard Lofton, and Daniel Princiati. We're going to begin with a prelude, which is going to help us figure out how we define poverty at the individual and neighborhood level. And then the rest of the presentation will have three acts. What is concentrated poverty, who experiences it, and where is it found? Then we're going to talk about how does concentrated poverty impact student success and which districts and schools face the biggest challenges. Finally, we'll conclude in our third act with what do we know about solutions at the school and neighborhood levels. So, how should we think about what do we know about how we define poverty and how this informs our perceptions and actions? Poverty can be both an individual family experience and a group neighborhood experience. At the individual family level, poverty means not having enough money to provide or acquire the basics: food, shelter, clothing, heat, medicine, and or to live in a safe and healthy environment. Poverty at the group neighborhood level means living in areas where many other people are poor as well, or as the census defines it, in quote, a spatial density of socioeconomic deprivation, end quote. Poverty and low income are not the same thing, though in the media, policy reports, and daily conversation, they often are used interchangeably. And this actually leads, we argue, to impeding our ability to solve the impacts of poverty on school success. When we see poverty and low income as the same thing and use them as synonyms, we're actually making it harder to solve the problem because we're lacking clarity in the level of challenge we're talking about it and who experiences it. Let's take a minute and look at some definitions. Economic hardship is defined by the Census Bureau and is determined really about how far you are from above or below the poverty level. And this varies by how big your household is. So here we're showing examples for a household of 4. Low income is defined as having being at less than 200% of the federal poverty level. So for a household of 4, that means having a family income of $48,500 or below. Poverty is defined at being at less than 100% of the poverty level. And for a household of 4, this is earning $24,250 or below. Extreme poverty is defined as less than 50% of the federal poverty level. So again, for our household of 4, this would be a family that only makes $12,125 a year or less. How many people and children experience economic hardship? So what this chart shows us is that how many people are at the low income level, what's the range, and how many children experience this level of low income or poverty. So we see at the low income level, those that make between 100% and 199% of the poverty level, we find 60 million people and 16 million children, which is about 22% of all children. At the poverty level, which ranges from being at 50% to 99% of the federal poverty level, we find about 25 million people, 8 million children, which is about 12%. At the extreme poverty level, which is earning less than half of the poverty level, we find 20 million people in total and 7 million children. Notice that there is about equal numbers of children living in poverty and extreme poverty, and together that adds up to about 22%. Overall, if we look at all these together, low income poverty and extreme poverty, we find there's about 106 million people in those conditions and about 44% of all children. This chart shows you by different race and ethnicity groups the percent of families that are qualified to be both low income and poor. And again, reminding ourselves that low income is essentially up to 200% of the federal poverty level. And again, we can see significant differences across race and ethnicity groups, and relatively high levels among African American, Latino, and American Indian families. We define economic hardship in our schools in a slightly different way, and this adds to the complexity. We use free and reduced lunch income eligibility to just figure out how many students in our schools live under economic hardship or economic disadvantage. To be eligible for free meals, a family has to be at or below 130% of the federal poverty level. So this is for a family of four, again, an income of about $30,000 or below qualifies you for free meals. Note that you get free meals for being at 130% of the federal poverty level or below, which is going to include both folks that are, by the census definition, poor and low income. For reduced price meals, you can be up to 185% of the federal poverty level, and this would be a household of four making up to $44,000 a year would qualify for reduced price meals. Thus, when school and free and reduced price lunch levels are used as a measure of poverty, it combines students who live in poverty with a subset of low-income students. This means that two schools with equal numbers of equally disadvantaged students, as measured by free and reduced price lunch levels, can serve two very different sets of students. This example is sort of at the extreme, but we're using the extremes to illustrate the point. So you could have two schools, both which report that half their students are eligible for free and reduced price lunch level. So people would typically say that both these schools, 50% of their students are low-income students. But in school A, this 50% of the free and reduced price lunch population could be made up of 2/3 of families having income of $35,000 or more, and 1/3 of families having incomes of less than $24,000, which means by census definition, 15% of students in the school live in poverty. A school with the same free and reduced price lunch level could alternatively have half their families have incomes below $12,500, and half of their families have incomes between $12,500 and $24,000, and have 50% of their students in the school live in poverty as defined by the census. So this just highlights two schools that would report the same level of economic hardship using free and reduced price lunch levels would be actually educating quite different sets of students in terms of their experience with poverty. Another way to think about and define poverty, as we noted in the beginning, is by place. And here the Census Bureau has two definitions. They define a high poverty neighborhood as census tracts with a poverty rate of at least 20% in a given year, meaning that at least 20% of the people that live in that census tract meet the federal definition of living in poverty. They also define something called distressed neighborhoods as census tracts with a poverty rate of at least 40% in a given year. These again would be neighborhoods where at least 40% of the people in the census tract live in poverty as defined by the census. Why were these thresholds chosen? Well, the Census Bureau picked the 20% threshold because that's where research showed that it was at that level one begins to see an impact of living in a neighborhood of socioeconomic deprivation above and beyond the individual impacts of poverty, controlling for other individual and group characteristics. This means at the 20% level, various studies were showing that you had an impact for just living in that neighborhood, whether you yourself were poor or not. Being in a neighborhood where at least 20% of people were in poverty had an impact on your outcomes over and above your individual characteristics. They also found in various research studies that impacts of neighborhood poverty accelerate as the concentrations climb from 20 to 40%. But at about the 40% level, they appear to hit their maximum impact one faces for living in a neighborhood of concentrated poverty. And also, when this threshold was established in the 1940s, the 40% threshold also corresponded to what were commonly seen as, quote, ghetto neighborhoods. Being low income or poor in a high poverty neighborhood thus creates a double burden. Living in communities with large concentrations of poverty causes additional burdens on residents that are beyond their own family circumstances. They must confront the poverty of those around them. These additional burdens are associated with being in neighborhoods with higher crime rates, poor housing conditions, fewer job opportunities, and more limited access to healthy food, including among other challenges. So again, the core idea is that if you are low income or poor, or even neither of those, but live in a high poverty neighborhood, you have an impact of living in that neighborhood that diminishes some of your outcomes, and then you have the additional burdens of your individual poverty level on top of that. Unfortunately, neighborhood poverty has increased substantially in the past decades. A report by the Brookings Institute shows that, quote, as poverty has spread, it has not done so evenly. Instead, it has become more clustered and concentrated in distressed and high poverty neighborhoods, eroding the brief progress made against concentrated poverty during the late 1990s. The challenges of poor neighborhoods, including worse health outcomes, higher crime rates, failing schools, and fewer job opportunities, make it much harder for individuals and families to escape poverty and often perpetuate and entrench poverty across generations. So given the double burden and the impacts of concentrated poverty, it is in fact a very troubling statistic that the percent of people who aren't poor who are also living in concentrated poverty increased substantially in the past decade. This chart here tries to gather what we know about how many people live and experience neighborhood poverty. And it's again showing at the 20% level, the 30% level, or 40% level, meaning 20% of the people in the neighborhood or more are poor, 30% or more are poor, 40% or more are poor. And we see that about 77 million people in America live in high poverty neighborhoods using the 20% threshold. And this represents a quarter of all the population, and about half of the people who live in poverty, who are poor themselves, live in a high poverty neighborhood. And this is about 20 million children live in high poverty neighborhoods, or about 28% of all children. At the 30% level, we see there are about 30 million people in the United States live in neighborhoods where 30% or more of people are poor, which is about 10% of the population. So quite a big drop when we move from the 20 to 30% threshold, from a quarter to 10% of the population. And we find still 10 million children, or about 14% of all children, living in neighborhoods of 30% or more poverty. And we take it to the most extreme level, distressed neighborhoods at 40% or more poverty. We see it's now about 11 million people in total, 4% of the population, and about 12% of all poor people living in these neighborhoods. So we have a complex takeaway here. At least half of the people in high poverty distressed neighborhoods are not poor individually. But given what we know about residential segregation, most are likely low income, especially in distressed neighborhoods, where nationally 75% of people who live in a distressed neighborhood, that is neighborhoods where 40% or more of the people in that census tract are poor, are either poor or low income. Thus, low-income students in these neighborhoods are affected by living in concentrated poverty, as well as students living in poverty themselves. This tells us the key metric in terms of impact on student success is the percent of students living in these neighborhoods and the concentration of them within schools. Thus, the growth of neighborhood poverty over the past decade suggests that the scale and intensity of student needs have likely increased in the schools that serve these areas. Right? Because concentrated poverty has increased, and concentrated poverty affects both those that are poor and those that are low income or not poor but live in those neighborhoods. As those neighborhoods have gotten larger over the past decade, impacting more people, that tells us that our schools are going to be facing a greater challenge of more students demonstrating the impacts of living in neighborhoods of concentrated poverty, whether they themselves are poor or not. Therefore, if we map the growth of moreover, if we map the growth of neighborhood poverty, it shows that this impact has been unevenly felt across states and regions. All right, this first map shows us how many people in a county live in a high poverty area using the 20% threshold. So essentially saying how many people in a county live in a high poverty neighborhood where 20% or more people in that neighborhood are poor. And this first map shows us what the nation looked like in 2000. And here we can essentially see sort of the traditional pattern of poverty in America. We see an intense cluster in Appalachia. We see it sort of in the south running along the coast from North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, through Florida, into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, up into Arkansas. We see it in the border towns with Mexico, through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. We sort of see inland California, and then sort of Native American Indian reservations in sort of the upper west along the Canadian border. Look what happens by 2010. We see sort of concentrated poverty spreading out from its traditional areas into surrounding areas. And we see, especially in the Northeast, this sort of patchwork pattern emerging where some counties experience significant numbers of concentrated poverty and those some next to it don't. We see Michigan, for example. We can see the impacts of the recession on the auto industry, getting quite a bit more areas of concentrated poverty. Interestingly, if you look, this area here around D.C. And the nation's capital, we see is still relatively free of concentrated poverty. So many of the decision makers were not personally experiencing neighborhoods of concentrated poverty as it was expanding in the rest of the nation. Our focus in this presentation today will be on the students and schools that experience concentrated poverty at its most extreme, those who live in neighborhoods with 40% or higher poverty rates. So we're really saying, what is the impact on school success of the people that live in the neighborhoods with the highest degree of concentrated poverty, those that are called distressed neighborhoods by the census, and in which 40% or more of the people in that census tract live in poverty. Now I'm going to turn you over to my colleagues to take us through the rest of the presentation. Richard will take us through Act 1 on who, what, where in terms of concentrated poverty, and also through some of the educational consequences of Act 2 of its impact on students and schools. Dan will then introduce us to some new research we've done on how many schools and districts experience the impacts of students living in concentrated poverty and at what magnitude. And then Maxine will bring us to and through Act 3 and tell us what can be done about this.